If you've lived long enough, you've probably learned one unforgettable truth. When someone else tells your story, they rarely tell it right. For generations, that has been Africa's burden. Powerful voices from far away shaped the narrative while the people living the reality were pushed to the background. And nowhere is this more evident than in Burkina Faso, a nation of farmers, a nation of early risers, a nation that has quietly carried the weight of its own survival. Picture this for a moment. The sun hasn't even stretched over the horizon yet the countryside is already awake. Older men walk slowly but confidently toward the fields they have known their entire lives. Women move with practiced steps, preparing water-gathering tools. Children, still rubbing sleep from their eyes, help carry the buckets and small supplies. It's a rhythm built over generations, steady, familiar, almost sacred. And that's precisely why the old reality never made sense. How could a country filled with farmers still end up importing more than 200,000 tons of rice every year? How could hardworking families, people who spent their whole lives growing food, stand and watch foreign grains fill their local markets? Anyone who has lived through broken systems or empty promises can understand their frustration. It wasn't about laziness, and it wasn't about lack of knowledge. The system around them simply wasn't built to help them succeed. Decades of neglect left these communities stranded. Tools were outdated, credit was out of reach, storage facilities were nearly non-existent, and policies were often drafted in offices far removed from the soil that mattered. Every new government promised improvement, and every promise dissolved into the same familiar silence. But then came a moment of pause and a shift. When Ibrahim Traoré stepped in, he didn't start with speeches or committees. He started with conversations, real ones, the kind that happen under a tree beside a well, or at the edge of a field. He walked through dry soil, listened without rushing, and allowed people to speak until their voices felt heard again. For many, it was the first time in years that anyone in power seemed to care about the world they woke up to every morning. And that is where this story begins, in the quiet places, with the people the world rarely sees, and with a nation ready to reclaim the authorship of its own future. For anyone who has watched global affairs long enough, especially viewers in America, who remember the rise and fall of agricultural towns, mills, and local industries, the story of Burkina Faso feels strangely familiar. It is the story of hardworking people trapped inside a system that refused to work for them. For decades, Burkina Faso's farmers lived in a cycle that felt almost impossible to break. They woke early, they worked hard, and they survived on hope, yet year after year, the progress they were promised never arrived. Every administration that came to power had a new slogan, a new project, or a new pilot program designed to fix agriculture. But those efforts were always small, temporary, and disconnected from the realities of the countryside. The deeper problem wasn't the farmers, it was the structure surrounding them. Tools stayed outdated for generations. Credit was so difficult to obtain that many farmers simply stopped asking. Storage facilities were too few, leaving crops vulnerable to rot and waste. And worst of all, agricultural policies were often written far away from the fields they were meant to fix, in conference rooms, in offices, or in collaboration with foreign consultants who never touched Burkinabe soil. That distance created a dangerous illusion. Officials believed they understood the problems, but they rarely heard the voices of the people living with those problems every day. And the consequences were real. One farmer described the stark difference between growing GMO cotton and growing conventional varieties. In 2015, the last year he planted GMO seeds, he made 3 million CFA. 1 year later, after shifting back to conventional seeds, his income dropped to just $575,000 CFA, an 80% collapse. Numbers like that aren't just statistics. They represent families struggling, children taken out of school, medical bills left unpaid, and entire communities sinking deeper into hardship. Farmers also spoke of pesticides used so frequently on cotton fields that the chemicals contaminated nearby food crops. Before meals were even eaten, stomach aches, headaches, diarrhea, and other sicknesses were common. These were realities that never made it into the glossy reports or policy memos. By the time we reached 2023, the year Ibrahim Traoré stepped into leadership, something inside rural Burkina Faso had shifted. Frustration wasn't just rising, it had reached its limit. Many farmers had simply given up on complaining. They had told their stories so many times that they no longer believed anyone was listening. And then, something unusual happened. Traoré didn't enter villages with a long speech or a prepared list of solutions. He didn't arrive with an entourage waiting for applause. He arrived quietly, sometimes unexpectedly, walking through fields, touching dry soil with his own hands, and standing shoulder to shoulder with the people who fed the country. Some farmers didn't even speak at first. They had grown accustomed to officials who showed up, nodded, and left, never to be seen again. But when they realized Traoré wasn't rushing them, that he wasn't treating their frustration as an inconvenience, they began to open up. One by one, they explained the missing pieces of their lives' tools. They could never afford crops. They couldn't store seasons. They couldn't predict land they couldn't fully cultivate. The more they spoke, the clearer the picture became. Burkina Faso didn't need charity. It needed a government willing to treat farmers not as beneficiaries but as partners. And for the first time in many years, something changed. Not with a dramatic announcement, but with understanding. Those conversations became the spark. They didn't create excitement. They created clarity. A simple truth emerged. A nation with millions of farmers should not depend on foreign countries for food. And a country built on agriculture deserves a system strong enough to support those who work the land. This realization became the foundation for everything that came next. The policies, the investments, and the historic transformation that began quietly but forcefully. The turning point did not come with a loud declaration. It did not come with a parade, a ceremony, or a televised announcement. It came with something far more powerful: action. Clear, measurable, immediate action. And for a country that had grown tired of promises, this change felt almost unbelievable. Once Ibrahim Traoré finished listening to the farmers, he didn't tell them to wait for a committee or a study. He didn't say their concerns needed to be reviewed. Instead, he returned to the capital and did something that no administration before him had done. With such determination, he dedicated 78 billion CFA francs exclusively to agricultural equipment. For a nation that had been stuck for decades, hearing that number felt unreal. But even more surprising than the amount of money was what happened next. The equipment didn't sit in warehouses. It didn't disappear into bureaucratic fog. It didn't get delivered to favored contractors or political insiders. It went straight to the people who actually needed it. Tractors, seeders, tillers, plows, fertilizers, real tools, not symbolic gestures. For so long, previous programs had begun with excitement and ended in disappointment. The machinery was sometimes poorly adapted to local conditions. The funding dried up halfway. Training never arrived. And farmers learned to see government projects as short-term boosts, followed by long-term silence. This time, they noticed something different almost immediately. Agricultural engineers, people who had spent years behind desks in city offices, were suddenly living and working among the communities. For the first time since independence, technical support wasn't an occasional visit. It was consistent, daily, and reliable. If a machine broke, someone was there. If a farmer needed guidance, help arrived the same day. If a field required adjustment or calibration, it was handled before planting season slipped away. Farmers didn't feel supervised. They felt supported. Slowly, doubt began to fade, replaced by something many rural families hadn't felt in generations: confidence. And then the results came. Fields that once took a week to prepare were now ready in a single afternoon. Planting that used to require waiting on unpredictable rains could now be completed quickly enough to catch even the shortest weather windows. The stress that hovered over every planting season began to ease. By the end of the campaign, yields had increased by 35 to 40%. Not 5%, not 10%, but numbers big enough to reshape an entire national economy. And when the harvests came in, families saw the difference instantly. Shelves stayed fuller. Markets stayed fed. Communities that had accepted hunger seasons as a part of life suddenly found themselves with surpluses. But something else happened. Something deeper. Something harder to measure on paper. A psychological shift. In villages across the country, people began to plan again. Not cautiously, not timidly, but with renewed energy. They spoke about expanding fields, trying new crops, working together on community gardens, investing in small processing projects, building the kind of future they once believed belonged only to other nations. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it was steady, a quiet awakening spreading from one village to another. Foreign observers were stunned. They had expected another failed program, another temporary improvement, another story of hope turning into disappointment. But what they saw instead was a transformation that did not slow down even in the face of growing insecurity. And that led to the next surprise: how was Burkina Faso growing more food while dealing with some of the most difficult security challenges in the region? The world looked confused, but people inside Burkina Faso understood exactly why. Because for them, stopping had never been an option. For most of the outside world, the story of Burkina Faso is usually told through one lens: insecurity, attacks, displacement, instability. These are the headlines people in the US or Europe normally see on the evening news. And to be fair, yes, these realities exist. The danger is real. Families have been torn from their homes. Entire villages have had to relocate for safety. But what most of the world does not understand is how Burkinabe communities adapted, persisted, and found ways to survive, even rebuild, in the middle of crisis. This is where the story takes on a much deeper meaning. Because while outsiders asked, "How can a country farm during conflict?" the people living the reality answered, "Because life cannot stop." Fields still needed planting, families still needed to eat, and a nation still needed to stand. That is why the success of the agricultural offensive felt so extraordinary. Under the logic of war, production should have collapsed. Harvests should have withered. Farmland should have been abandoned. But instead, Burkina Faso produced more food, not less, and even achieved grain surpluses for 2 consecutive years. And the reason for this is not magic. It is strategy. Traoré's government understood something previous leaders did not. You cannot separate food security from national security. They are one and the same. So the state reorganized the entire agricultural map. Areas under immediate threat shifted production to safer zones. Villages located in high-risk regions received mechanized support to reduce exposure, because a job that once required days of manual labor could now be completed in a few hours with a tractor or a tiller. Less time in the open meant fewer risks. Farmers didn't need to be soldiers, they just needed tools that protected their time and shortened their vulnerability. At the same time, the AES alliance strengthened intelligence sharing. Drones from Niger monitored militant movements and identified danger routes. This wasn't a grand international mission. It wasn't a Western-backed program. It was practical cooperation between neighbors who understood each other's struggles. Farmers didn't receive daily intelligence briefings, but they felt the difference. Suddenly, movements in and out of fields became more predictable. Risky areas were flagged. Entire communities felt less like they were walking blind. And then came one of the most significant shifts, one almost no analyst predicted. Instead of leaving displaced families in limbo, the government converted displacement into participation. A plan was launched to create 100,000 agricultural jobs specifically for internally displaced people, IDPs. That meant land clearing, irrigation work, community farming, small processing tasks, storage operations, practical roles that allowed displaced citizens to earn an income, gain stability, and break the vulnerability that insurgent groups often prey on. This strategy changed everything. IDPs who once felt powerless suddenly became contributors. Instead of camps filled with frustration and boredom, communities saw cooperation and renewed purpose. It wasn't perfect. No system born in a conflict environment ever is. But the logic behind it was powerful. Give people food, give them work, give them dignity, and insecurity loses its best weapon. As months passed, the countryside began to show signs of resilience that had not been seen in years. Fields once abandoned were cultivated again. Community groups organized themselves more efficiently. Local defense units and farmers coordinated their movements, not militarily, but practically simply to ensure everyone could work without unnecessary risk. And gradually, something profound happened in the collective consciousness of the country. People stopped seeing themselves as victims of a crisis. They began seeing themselves as participants in a national comeback. The link between farming and stability became undeniable. Families understood it. Communities understood it. And even those watching from afar quietly, cautiously began to understand it too. This is why the agricultural offensive is more than an economic policy. It is a civil movement, a political statement, a message that a nation under pressure can still choose resilience, dignity, and direction. And this resurgence, this sense of standing again, naturally awakened memories of a time when Burkina Faso once believed in its own strength. Which leads us to a deeper part of the story. Why does today's movement feel so connected to the spirit of Thomas Sankara? From the outside, especially from the vantage point of American viewers who follow international affairs closely, the transformation happening in Burkina Faso feels almost unreal. In a world where most headlines about Africa focus on conflict, poverty, or political instability, the idea of a country increasing food production during insecurity challenges every expectation. Many Americans, over 60 people who lived through the Vietnam War, the energy crises of the 1970s, or the farm struggles across the Midwest, understand something essential. When systems break, communities suffer first. That is why watching a nation reverse decades of decline resonates so deeply. It reminds them of a time when local strength, community cooperation, and self-reliance were core American values. Yet mainstream global media, including outlets frequently consumed in the U.S., rarely highlight these positive shifts. When Burkina Faso appears on major American networks, the narrative often emphasizes threats, not solutions, instability, not resilience. That is why this story feels so refreshing, because it contradicts the oversimplified portrayals that have shaped Western perceptions of Africa for generations. In policy circles, American analysts quietly acknowledge that something meaningful is happening. A country historically dependent on imports is now producing surpluses. A government criticized for its youth and inexperience is delivering concrete results where older administrations failed. and a population long ignored by international institutions, is finally shaping its own development model. But the biggest surprise for many in the West is how integrated the Burkinabe strategy is. Agriculture, security, displacement, local industry, none of these are treated separately. They function as parts of the same national equation. This holistic approach is rare, even in wealthier nations. Some American observers wonder whether this model could influence broader African policy. Others question how long it can last, and whether external pressure, political, military, or economic, will eventually try to slow it down. These questions echo concerns many older Americans ask themselves: can a young leader like Ibrahim Traoré maintain momentum? Is this truly a sustainable path, or is it a momentary exception? What's clear is that the world is paying closer attention, not through headlines, but through quiet curiosity. Burkina Faso is challenging assumptions, rewriting expectations, and reminding viewers abroad that Africa's most important stories often unfold far away from global cameras. And as this movement grows, it sets the stage for the final question. If growing food is the first step, what happens when Burkina Faso begins processing, transforming, and owning the full value of what it produces when you look closely at the journey? Burkina Faso is taking you begin to realize this isn't just a story about farming. It's not even just a story about national policy or political leadership. It's a story about something much deeper, the moment when a people decide to trust their own strength again. The progress didn't begin with machinery or money. It began with dignity. It began with conversations under trees, in dusty fields, in villages the world rarely thinks about. It began when everyday men and women, farmers, elders, displaced families, finally felt that their voices mattered. And once that happened, the country's direction changed. But every transformation comes with a warning. History teaches us, and many viewers in America know this well, that the moment a nation starts to stand on its own feet, external pressures tend to appear. Interests shift. Narratives change. Headlines twist. That is why Burkina Faso's movement toward self-reliance is not just courageous. It is fragile. It must be protected, understood, and supported by those who believe in fairness and truth. And here is the important part. The world is watching more closely than it admits. Analysts, governments, and institutions are asking how far this model can go. Ordinary people across West Africa are wondering if this transformation could ignite a regional awakening. And many who follow Africa news are beginning to recognize that the future of the continent may not be written in foreign capitals anymore, but in places like Ouagadougou, Bobo Dioulasso, and the countless rural communities reclaiming control of their fields. This raises the question we must all consider. Do you believe that President Ibrahim Traoré's national reform strategy will hold strong, or do you think another leader should rise to continue what has begun? These are the kinds of questions that shape history, because they ask us to look beyond headlines and examine the real lives behind the story. One thing is certain: the people of Burkina Faso have shown the world that self-reliance is not an outdated dream. It is a living possibility driven by courage, unity, and the simple human desire to feed one's own family with dignity. If you feel you're among the first to truly understand this story, please share this video. If you believe truth matters more than headlines, subscribe and stay with us, because the future of Burkina Faso is being written right now, and your voice, your understanding, is part of that story.